Welcome to Equine-Assisted World. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horseboy, The Long Ride Home and The Healing Land. Before I jump in with today's guest, I just want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do, please like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really helps us get this work done. As you might know from my books, I'm an autism dad. And over the last 20 years, we've developed several equine-assisted, neuroscience-backed certification programs. If you'd like to find out more about them, go to newtrailslearning.com. So without further ado, let's meet today's guest. Welcome back to Equine-Assisted World. Today, I've got Robyn Hood. That sounds anachronistic, perhaps. I don't mean a man in tights with a longbow on his back. I mean the amazing sister of the amazing Linda Tellington-Jones. Those of you who know about TTouch, the Linda Tellington-Jones method of using touch to ameliorate, bond with, reach and help with any kind of horse training and people and dogs and so on. Anyone who doesn't know about TTouch, go and type it into Google now. TTouch. It's a wonderful thing. We've been, fans of it and practicing it on our own horses and each other and our dogs for over a decade. And Linda Tellington-Jones, of course, is a legend within the horse community and was one of the first people to bring this idea of healing through horses into the mainstream, really. Not as many people know about her younger sister. And Robyn and Linda have been working together for many, many, many years. And a lot of the systemization behind the TTouch method, one could say, has, come thanks to this wonderful relationship between the sisters and Robyn's input. So I wanted to not just talk to Linda. If you haven't heard our two podcasts with Linda, one on Live Free, Ride Free, and one here on Equine-Assisted World, go click on those links now. But today I want to go a little deeper into TTouch with Robyn and look at what are the things that we as equine practitioners need to know. What can we benefit from in terms of how we approach, touch, interact with our horses, how our clients do, not just with our horses, but the other social animals that we have and with each other, we being social animals as well. There's a lot that we can glean from mentors like Robyn. So even though many of us, of course, hold the well-being of the equines we work with, in the highest of priorities, because we hold them in that priority, we need to talk to people like Robyn and learn as much as we can. So Robyn, thanks so much for coming on the show. And please tell us who you are and what is TTouch? What's it all about?
That's always a $64,000 question. What is TTouch? So first of all, it's interesting. Of course, our family name is Hood, and Linda named me. Actually, I was the second last to be born, and she came home and said, "Oh, you have to name this one Robyn." The funny thing is, our mother's name was Marion, so we had Maid Marion, and I have a brother named John. So we have little John and Maid Marion. And when I was a child, I used to do a lot of horse showing, and I used to ride two horses from other people, and one was called Friar Tuck and one was called Little John. So here comes Robyn Hood riding Friar Tuck. So anyway, that was a good laugh, people. So I've kind of grown up with that. And it was a little tricky when I was younger, but when I got married, I chose to keep my own name. And I've had the opportunity, Linda's 14 years older than I am. And I spent a lot of time when I was young, before I was on a horse, before I could walk. And when I could walk, she would throw me on a horse bareback and hit, slap them on the butt. So I'd get cantered into the stable. My mother was, of course, horrified, but, it's the way it was. And then Linda left when I was 3. She moved to California. That was quite hard for me. And then I started to go to work with her when I was 9. And I would go in the summers and fly to California by myself, which, back in the day, 1959, 60, was pretty unusual, especially crossing the border. And I'm so lucky to have Linda. And the thing is, I don't want to be Linda. And I think that's actually why our relationship works. I always make this kind of joke, and it's not that, she's kind of the show horse and I'm the workhorse. And that doesn't mean she doesn't work, but I really like kind of being behind the scenes and supporting what she's doing, and sometimes redirecting her a little bit, because she has a lot of ideas that were at least 20 years ahead of her time. And, that's the good news and the bad news, like everything. And so I did a newsletter I started in 83, I think, and I did it till 2017, 4 times a year, and about the method and about Linda's travels, which were, incredibly, incredibly interesting. And so I love this work. I love being able to connect with people and their animals, because if we can't relate to the people, it's hard to actually have them help their animals. And so for me, learning is constantly, like, I believe that we can always make something better. It's not about something it has to be like this. I think we need a framework of what I've kind of tried to do is make a baseline. And then I often say to people that this work is written in sand rather than written in stone. And I think that it allows people that they learn the basic techniques, and then they can use their intuition or the feeling and carry on with it. So that's where I think that's kind of the role that I play with Linda.
What is TTouch exactly?
So TTouch, there's the question. So I actually really prefer, in Europe they call it more the Tellington method.
Mm-hmm.
And because the misnomer is that it's only about touch. So TTouch is basically a gentle way of communicating with animals and with interacting with animals that is what I say low stress, because every time we do anything different, there's a certain amount of stress, but it's low stress, and it's really considering how animals learn. And that's our interest is in looking about the learning. So we have different components. There's the observation, which you ideally are doing all the time with your animal, and what we're looking for is small things, not big things. We don't want to wait till they shout at us. We'd rather listen to their whispers. And then, of course, there's the body of work known as the Tellington TTouch, which is a gentle form of hands-on communication with your horse. And there are various techniques that we use that are really easy to learn. And I think that's one of the things that is so beautiful about this work, is that you can teach people it in a pretty short period of time. We also have the groundwork. And there's, I remember years ago, people were starting to do body work on horses. There was at the time when we started nearly 50 years ago, it was considered a little bit odd. But so what we found is that you could do body work, but if you didn't take that into mindful movement, as in the Feldenkrais method, then there was a lot that was missed. And unfortunately, there's more and more groundwork being done, but some of it actually kind of takes away from any body work you might have done, because it puts horses in posture. It's not functional. And so we're looking for functional posture. We're helping them have a different way of moving. Of course, we also have some equipment we use, like body wraps, to bring more awareness. We have what we call the joy of riding. So it's about this whole, parts of it. So we started, I've had up to 200 horses here on my property. And we, for 40 years, have started our own horses that way. Hundreds of horses we've started. So it's a step by step. I believe that horse training should be like watching paint dry. Shouldn't be exciting.
You mentioned something called Feldenkrais. What's that?
Moshe Feldenkrais was an Israeli physicist who had a physical injury himself, and he was also a master of martial arts. And he took what he knew about martial arts and broke down every bit of movement in his body. And I still think that Feldenkrais is one of the best kept secrets. For his intention was to improve the movement and of dancers and athletes and their performance. And he ended up working with people with very serious injuries, strokes, cerebral palsy, all sorts of things and he's got a great Facebook page called the Feldenkrais Method, and it shows Moshe working with a young man that had been really not being able to move very well with his CP, and in one session made such a difference to the possibility. And so check it out. It's something that I think is really useful for anyone, whether you have any, disabilities or not, because the philosophy of it is so similar.
It's an interesting thing. I've experienced a bit of Feldenkrais, and I always love it when AI tries its hand with Feldenkrais, because it comes back as failed in Christ, which I always think is rather wonderful.
Oh, that's hilarious. Oh my God.
You're failed in Christ, you can, but the Feldenkrais method, actually in German, what does it mean? It just means a field circle. It's a type of bodywork that's very, very gentle, as you say, almost like sort of chiropractic or osteopathy, but without all the cracking and with very, very subtle, tiny movements. And I do know that there has been a crossover to some degree between Feldenkrais and TTouch. Can you talk to us about what are the qualities of these movements, whether for humans or for horses? Why so subtle? Because some of us, for example, I like deep pressure. I like subtle pressures, but I do like deep pressure. Other people I know don't. Everybody's nervous system is a little bit different. So what do you feel is the key with the subtlety of these movements? Because both Feldenkrais and TTouch, it's not hard deep pressing. It is more subtle. What's the quality?
If we think about the nervous system and we think about muscles, so when people like deep tissue massage, they like it to go in, it may affect the muscle, but it's actually the nervous system that tells the muscle what to do. And so what my experience is, I personally don't like deep tissue work because it makes me really sore and I'm not really into pain. And there's doesn't mean that you can't have a certain amount of discomfort and it be okay. And there, certainly in the Feldenkrais work, there is sort of a portion of it that's not 100% gentle. There's depending on the practitioner and so on. But you're right, it's a lot more like what I would call classical osteopathy, because there's two kinds of osteopathy. There's one that's like healing basically, and then there's the one that is more manipulative. What my experience is that, first of all, especially with animals, we have to find a way to make contact with them that they say it's okay. And there's no animal on this planet that I know that when you go in and cause discomfort, that they're going to go, great, do more. And in fact, some of the techniques that are used on horses that are really deep work, they'll say, leave this door open so you can get away if they kick you, or things like that. So it may help in some ways that you're releasing some tissue or something at the moment. It usually comes back pretty quickly. So if we don't, what I find is that, like, we have techniques that you can go in deep without going in hard. There's a huge difference with that. And the people that I worked with, many people that have had that they've maybe used their upper body a lot, so they're super tight, and they've had lots of deep tissue work. And it helps in the moment, but it comes back so quickly, the sort of discomfort. And I remember one groomer who had really tight shoulders. And so I did some lifts with the wraps and I did some different things on her shoulders. And she told me that I because of her sort of preference to heavy work, and then she told me that it hadn't really worked, I went less. And I went less, but I waited longer. And then as I started this little release with her, her shoulder just kept going down and down and down and down and down. And she said, I've never felt that release before because my body's always been protective. And so I think that especially with animals they're much more honest in their responses in a way than humans are. And of course you can be too light. TTouch falls into the category of light pressure touch. The really light touch is that alarming touch, like when a fly walks across you. That's not what we're looking for. And there
because
are
some horses really don't like that at all, become irritated.
Well,
Right, too light
we
of a
wouldn't
touch.
do that. I don't think any animal really likes it. So light pressure touch, what I call, and there's some horses that are super, super sensitive and the synapses overfire. So when you use light touch, it's not very comfortable. So then what we would do is apply what I call more positive pressure. So it would be diffusing the contact over a larger area, but creating a little bit more pressure that soothes, that sort of calms the synapses. So there are times that we'll go in deeper, but it won't be harder.
Can you describe for me, does make sense. Can you describe for me a fairly typical T-touch session? So let's say you arrive at my barn and my horses are hardworking boys and girls. So, like me, they've all got a desire to have ameliorative
Right.
touch, on their body. So you'd notice, let's say I've got an older horse and you'll notice perhaps he's a little stiff in the withers. Maybe his stifle is not everything it used to be, despite the fact that we're lunging and doing in hand and doing the best we can. But nonetheless, so let's say we walk in there and you cast your eye over the horse. You say, yep, I can see a couple of wear and tear spots. I can see where the horse is perhaps protecting itself. Let's say it was those two spots, withers and stifle. Can you describe to me more or less how you would operate and what's going on through your hands? What touches are you using? How are they helping? And how is this creating a bond between you and the horse that I, the owner, could then pick up on and continue once you leave the barn?
Man, that's a big question because pretty much our answer is usually it depends, because
Easy.
so the first thing
Take
is,
us to an imaginary scenario.
yeah. So I would say the first thing is, if I have a hardworking horse that is older, I have lots of old horses in my barn. I actually am looking to help them feel better. I'm not going to actually go in, and I don't want to necessarily bring a lot more awareness. I want to help them be able to maybe release tension, take deeper breaths, help them. And I wouldn't necessarily go to the areas that are described as being the issue.
Okay.
I would probably start on the opposite end of the body because the compensation patterns that happen. I want to find places that, so I'll just run my hands over the horse and watch for their really small response, a change in the ear, like a just different things that they might do. And then I'm going to change the contact so that they can say, oh yeah, this is okay. You're okay. You're actually going to listen to me, rather than going in and doing this. So I would explore probably extremities in the horse as well. So I might, ask them to pick up the foot, do some really small leg circles, but not for very long. I want to notice, how does the horse change their weight? How do they change their balance? With what ease can they pick up any foot or not? Was one side easier than the other? I would do something with the forelock, like doing forelock slides, because it actually is kind of like doing the tail touches, only on the other end. Take a hold
What
of.
are the tail touches?
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, there's a lot. So the thing is, the tail is, connects the whole spine, the back end to the front end. And so I generally on the tail would start standing at the side, a hand on the top of the croup, because that really lets me feel what's going on for the horse. I might start by just stroking the tail hairs from the base or the root of the tail out to the end, just at the top of the tail, and notice the response. Then I would pick up the hair on the top of the tailbone and pick it up and just circle the tail. Like, see, can they actually pick it up? Are they tight? Are they clamped in the tail? And then I just do like a gentle glide with the hair and then slowly release. And you'll be able to see the abdominal rectus muscle activates as you do various things with the tail, which is incredibly helpful for the back of the horse. So I would do that. And I also do that with a rider on board. I think there is nothing more important than doing some of the tail. I may circle the tail and do like a little plug in, if you will. So just gently, can the tail come into the body? Can they come out? What's the horse's response? Because when the rider's on board, the horse learns about the functional posture of carrying a rider rather. And so they kind of learn, the nervous system learns that, oh, that's interesting. When the tail comes back, my back comes up. So that's actually going to feel better. Same thing if I take the forelock and I literally just take it kind of right by the root. I may start with stroking the hair, and then I might circle the forelock right at the root. And then I put a little bit of glide out toward myself with a pause, and then slowly carry that back. And what the rider feels is this expansion through the rib cage, and it's incredibly beneficial. You feel more when they're with a bareback or a bareback pad, but you also feel it under the saddle, and you see the rider kind of move up and down. So the horse kind of gets a sense of that. So I kind of digress there, but I feel that that's really important. So there are a lot of things. We may do this gentle flexion of the tailbone, and what I notice is that as you just gently, we call it purling, take the tailbone in and out gently, that you feel different parts of the horse moving if you're sitting on it. So different parts of the spine moving.
Now, you're a lifelong seasoned horsewoman, and you breed Icelandic horses. You've been working at Linda's side for 300 years.
Yeah,
Yeah. But of course, many people within the equine assisted world, particularly, are often relative newcomers to horse owning and to horsemanship. And it can be a very confusing field. And as you know, it's rife with faction and it's rife with shaming. If you don't do this, all this sort of emotionally triggering language, if you don't do this, you're going to do something terrible to your horse and blah, blah, blah. So, of course, what happens is a lot of people come in and they're so terrified of doing something adverse with their horse or to their horse that they almost err on the side of doing too little, which, of course, is tricky because the horse is a super athlete bred for thousands of years to be a super athlete, has all this energy. And also somebody who hasn't grown up like you, able to read horse behavior. There's probably a time, you probably can never remember a time when you couldn't read horse behavior because it was just all around you. It was the family culture. But that's not true for a lot of other people. So these are some naive questions, but I want you to answer them as best you can. How do you know? How do you judge? How do you discern if a horse is having a positive reaction to what you're doing, as opposed to a neutral reaction, or maybe not even a reaction at all? Something moves in the body, but it's in response to something that's going on half a kilometer away that they're hearing or smelling. How do you discern what is a positive response?
It's a good question. I would say for me that just teaching people about noticing little shifts in weight with the horse. And I don't know that we can actually ever really know. There's this whole kind of culture that people will go, oh, this is good and this is bad. The horse yawns, it's good. Oh, the horse yawns, it's bad. The horse licks and chews, it's good. The horse licks and chews, it's bad.
Right.
You know what? How do we really
Massively
know?
confusing. Yeah.
How do we really know? And that's where I feel like if we pay attention to the small things, like does our horse just pay attention to the ears, what they're doing. And that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just maybe means that the horse is paying attention. Pay attention to the tension, maybe tension, or if you see lines around the mouth, or maybe you see them yawning. And I think most of these things, licking and chewing, yawning, and so on, blinking, they're a response of the nervous system.
They can mean many things.
Full stop. They can mean lots of things.
Yeah.
And I think it's a huge mistake when we say, one is this and one is that. I think we have to just be a bit more neutral in our response and pay attention to it. Like, pay attention to when does it happen. If you are doing something, you see a response and you go back to where you saw sort of more, what I would say, kind of neutral response. Does the horse change? Because I think so often we don't pay attention to when horses are really trying to tell us something. So, for example, grooming is one of the biggest things that I have people pay attention to. That's generally one of our first physical interactions with the horse. So if your horse has to be cross-tied to be groomed, then I suggest you set up a situation where they don't have to be cross-eyed, so you can actually see what their response is. Do they turn around do they pin their ears? Do they move around? Do they turn around to bite you? And I had someone ask me at a class, does doing TTouch make your horse bite? And I said, well, not usually. And I said, what was happening? And she said, well, I was grooming him and he was turning around to bite me and I was grooming him in the stall. And I said, well, where do you normally groom? She said, he's in cross ties. So in the cross ties, he can't give any information. He can move his hind end around, but people usually kind of tell them to stand still. And, if you get after them enough and you are, like positive enough in what you're doing, you can get horses to put up with a lot of things if they don't have that restriction. So can we go slower when we groom? Can we use a different kind of brush? Use it on yourself. Like just take a brush on your own arm and brush. Like I went all through Pony Club and of course we're taught, use this flicking motion. Well, a lot of horses really don't like that. And all it does is move the dirt from one place to another. So what happens if you turn the brush on the side a bit and you do a long, slow stroke? What happens then? And notice what the horse's reaction. And I think that's one of the best ways for people who aren't familiar with horses is to just start to notice response. Like notice, hopefully quiet. If it's a big response, then you really ideally change something that you do. So I think that's a good way. And also when you just approach your horse, how do you approach your horse? If you approach your horse from the shoulder. So I've been importing horses from Iceland since 1977. And in Iceland at the time, the only way they could catch a horse was to put them in a small pen, put them in a corner, and then walk up to them and catch them. They couldn't walk up to them in a pasture and just put a halter on. So that was the first thing that we taught our horses, is that you could just walk up and catch them. So we'd use a little bit of dried bread and we'd give them a little bread. We'd do a little scratch, we'd walk away. And then we'd go back up and start that way. So I think how we catch horses is also really important. How our first interaction, using the back of the hand instead of the palm, is it for most horses. Stroking just down the side of the neck is much more acceptable for most horses, especially a horse you don't know. When you walk towards a horse, if they look at you, and this is, in pastures, we've had so many horses that were hard to catch. If I'd stop, and then I would just look away. And then if the horse looked away and then looked back, I could always walk up and catch them. So I think that just paying attention to small things in the pasture or in a paddock or whatever, when you start to make contact, can be really beneficial.
Yeah, I think that sometimes one overthinks these things. I mean, we're all mammals, and I think all mammals enjoy certainly that we have this thing called the mammalian caregiving system. So whether we're dogs being suckled, whether we're pigs, whether we're horses, whether we're monkeys, there's a certain just amount of touch, embracing, and the intention, long, slow strokes, as you've said. And these seem to go across all species. And then this thing of, do they seem to seek more? I've got, you talked about the forelock pull. So I've got a horse that, if you pull his forelock, man, he's just going to be with you going, hey, how about that forelock thing? And, and he'll actively like move his head, basically put his head right where your hand is and say, I would like some more of that, please. It's very, very clear, but he's a very connected sort of a guy who's very human focused. There could be another horse that's shy who might like it, who might not show it quite so blatantly, but nonetheless appears to exhale, drop the head, half close the eye, do sort of things that we might do, that a dog might do, that other mammals might do, that denote pleasure, because oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins are common to us all, right? So it's interesting to me that you guys at TTouch seem to have found your way into a number of ways that, when I observe it, seem to create those hormones in the horse. And you seem to have a repertoire of particular types of touch. You mentioned some of them now. And those listeners who've listened to my podcast with Linda will know about this business of the circle and a quarter. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to me a bit about that? What is the value of the circle and a quarter movement? How do you do it? And what do you observe in terms of the horse's pleasure responses? If you were going to say to me, Rupert, over Zoom, I'm going to teach you how to do the circle and a quarter thing with your hand. How would you do it?
Well, I think that I probably, first of all, I kind of look at the person and depends a bit on their hands, for instance. Like if you're working with someone who maybe has some arthritis in their hands, then I'm going to have them put the whole of the hand so the fingers and the palm, not the middle of the palm, because that's sort of concave for most people, but just put it gently on the animal. And then just think about moving the tissue. So it's like your hand is kind of Velcroed to the body, and you're going to move the tissue starting in an upward fashion. So it's going to start with a lift. So if you think about going around this clock, and of course, now that we have so many digital clocks, I don't even know how people are going to learn like kids. But if 6 on the clock is the lowest point of gravity, you're going to make contact with that. And then you're going to move the skin under your hand. The thing that people do a lot of times is they rub. And if you instead can move the tissue in approximately a circle and a quarter, have a little pause, and then either carry it back towards where 6 was, or you can just lightly take your hand off and move to another place. I think the most important thing, and I often have people just put their hand on their arm so that they can, on their upper arm, so that they can actually feel the movement. Because the skin is a little bit looser on most people's arms, say, than maybe even on a horse's. And, if the tissue is really tight, I actually suggest to people that they imagine that they're moving the tissue. Because when we imagine doing something, our nervous system does something. And something will happen under our hand. Because if the tissue is really tight, I see people just kind of rubbing it across. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad. It's just that there's a different experience with that. And we have so many parts of the hand to use. If an animal's really sensitive, then we might curve our fingers. So we're going to use the backs of our first 2 knuckle joints to make that same kind of contact. It'll diffuse the contact a little bit. I actually have to say, I think one of the reasons that the circles are useful is that they're a different habit for people. When our habits bypass the thinking part of our brain, right? And that's what makes habits useful. And it's what makes them easy. We don't have to think about doing a habit, right? We have to think about doing something else. And so if I want to change something, I have to change something, which sounds super obvious. But if I can give them some way it can't be too different. Like that's why I look at people's hands and I look at how they just automatically make contact with their animals. And then I pick a touch that I think will be a little different. Because it's the same with our animals. If we want to change habits, we can't just say, one habit is really bad, we're going to take you into something else. We have to expand. We have to step them out of the habit and then let them come back in and step out and come back in so that comfort zone gets bigger. And so that would be the same thing even with people and the contact that they're making. I might start with somebody and say, what about if you stroked the horse's mane? Maybe what you do is you take a little contact at the root of the mane and you do a little circle and a quarter and you pause and then you stroke probably in the direction the hair grows, so up a little bit, and then pause a bit. Because, our in-breath activates the sympathetic and our out-breath, the parasympathetic, which is why that exhale is so important. And people think that I have to warn people. I said, I'm not exasperated. I'm not bored. That audible exhale is about grounding. And what I find is that everyone around me will do it. And the animals will do it as well. So I think that the circles are important. I think they're important because they actually help us to change a habit. And yes, they give a different kind of information to the body. And if we can change something that we do, I think that's actually probably the most important part of it because we start to think be mindful and be present and aware.
I think that's a very good point. I know that particularly those of us who are lifelong horse people tend to have methodologies that we are they're comfort zones for us. They came out of the culture that we were born into, and they have their pros and cons. But if we're not learning new languages, well, we're always going to be stuck speaking the same old dialect of whatever language it was, which will be great in certain contexts and completely useless in others. As we know, I'm sitting here in Germany, my London, South African vernacular is of limited value when I'm trying to order a drink in a bar in Frankfurt. So I've got to, and I think it's such an interesting thing that while we know as horse people that there's a whole world of equestrian culture, a universe of different equestrian cultures out there, none of which is better or worse than any other because they all have evolved for very specific jobs and are good at them, so that presumably they work. And yet we often have these defensive responses when we come across one that's unfamiliar to us. Oh, I don't like that. Yeah. I remember as a kid once being out hunting in Leicestershire, which is the horse culture I grew up in, which is very much cross-country riding, jumping, that sort of thing. And so hunting was a big part of it. And big fences, big hedges. So that's what it was all about. It was about being brave and riding at hedge and getting over. And I was listening to two local guys discussing an equestrian show they'd seen that had been coming through the area in the early 80s. And they were like, whoa, I don't teach my horse to do circus tricks. And I remember sitting there on my horse thinking, why not? Why wouldn't you? Like, what's wrong with that? And why maybe the horse would enjoy it? And why do you feel that the thing that we do has more merit than that thing? Interesting. So interesting that we limit ourselves in this way. And of course, therefore, presumably our animals. You have within TTouch a whole repertoire of different kinds of touches with quite exotic names and quite specific movements of the hand and finger that go now beyond the circle and a quarter sort of basis. Can you give us an example of some of those touches and their names and what they mean, what they're for, how they got their names, and how we might do them?
When Linda started with this work, and I remember we had sort of 5 basic touches, and basically they didn't have a name, they had a description. So we would use the flat of the hand, or we would, it was basically just giving a description. And because Linda's really interested in this concept of right, left brain learning, what she realized is that, first of all, we were working with animals. And by the way, TTouch is actually the only modality, like contact modality, that started with animals. Like most massage and Reiki and all these things, they started with people, and then people found the value. And so they went into, tried them on their animals. Fair enough. Linda went the opposite way. Even though our background, in 1963, she and her first husband wrote a book called Physical Therapy for the Athletic Horse. So they did do, like typical kind of massage on horses. But when she, found out about the Feldenkrais, she had to change it enough so it would be teachable.
Okay.
And so many of the names came from animals that she was working on. So for instance, the clouded leopard, she was at the Zurich Zoo and she was working with clouded leopards have spots, and she was working with these young cubs that were quite ill. And she said, okay, so she put the pads of her fingers on the spots, and she moved the spot in a circle and a quarter. So that became the clouded leopard, which is kind of the, sort of our hallmark touch, if you will. And then she thought, well, if I was to make my fingers a little flatter, which diffuses the contact, so the first and second flange would be making contact, that's when the leopard is lying their paws down. So that could be the lying leopard. And so it developed from that. The python lift, it was developed, which is basically, making contact, supporting the tissue up a little, pausing, and carrying the tissue back down. Started on Joyce the python. And so it was, and it was it was, Linda's experiences with these animals has been so profound. Joyce was at the San Diego Wild Animal Park, and she had a chronic lung infection. And typically they keep snakes in very small places, and people will say a snake wouldn't know the difference if it lived in a shoebox, which is pretty shocking that a person that actually knows reptiles would say that. Anyway, Joyce was lying across this stage, and she had some troubles. She had a lot of trouble breathing. And so Linda started doing these little lifts just along the side of her body. And excuse me, snakes have an amazing tissue. It's so wonderful to do touch on snakes. They don't feel anything like people think they're going to feel. Anyway, she's working along, doing these little touches along the body, a little bit behind the head. And all of a sudden, all of this stuff started to just expel out of this snake's nose. And so that was quite interesting. But the next day, when the snake was brought back up on stage, the snake went right past everybody, went in front of Linda, stood up, put her head up, and they do this little tongue flick to just check out their environment. And that's what he did with his head over her shoulder, or her head over her shoulder. And the cameraman, this one cameraman, was afraid of snakes, and he was actually in tears when he watched it because he thought snakes were so awful. And the fact that the snake clearly made a connection to her was beyond his knowledge. And so that became the Python lift. And so many of these touches have either come from a person who found that they needed to touch in a different way to make themselves comfortable. So for instance, the owl is when you can make a little circle with your thumb and your index finger. And Linda started using it on her ribs because it's an easy way to make that circle and a quarter on your ribs or on your back because your hand isn't twisted. And it feels different. It's not just that we kind of lie in bed at night and think of how can we have these different names. They feel different. They feel different. They're different for people to use. And we want to make it accessible. So we want to find things that individuals can do easily. For instance, if somebody has loose ligaments or is, double jointed, the lying leopard or the clouded leopard will be the hardest touch for them to do. Because when they make contact with the pads of the fingers, the first joint collapses, which creates more contact. So for that person, we'd say, do the chimp. So curve your fingers and use the back of the fingers, or use the flat of the hand so that you're not going to have this directed pressure.
If you're in the equine-assisted field, or if you're considering a career in the equine-assisted field, you might want to consider taking one of our 3 neuroscience-backed equine-assisted programs. Horseboy Method, now established for 20 years, is the original equine-assisted program specifically designed for autism, mentored by and developed in conjunction with Dr. Temple Grandin and many other neuroscientists. We work in the saddle with younger children, helping them create oxytocin in their bodies and neuroplasticity in the brain. It works incredibly well. It's now in about 40 countries. Check it out. If you're working without horses, you might want to look at movement method, which gets a very, very similar effect, but can also be applied in schools, in homes. If you're working with families, you can give them really tangible exercises to do at home that will create neuroplasticity when they're not with you. Finally, we have taquine equine integration. If you know anything about our programs, you know that we need a really high standard of horsemanship in order to create the oxytocin in the body of the person that we're working with, child or adult. So this means we need to train a horse in collection, but this also has a really beneficial effect on the horse's well-being. And it also ends your time conflict where you're wondering, oh my gosh, how am I going to condition my horses and maintain them and give them what they need, as well as serving my clients? Taquine equine integration, aimed at a more adult client base, absolutely gives you this.
Why was Linda working with these zoo animals? How did that come about as a horse person?
Why she was working with the snake?
Well, yeah, and other zoo animals, the clouded leopards. How did that evolve?
Well, some from the Icelandic horses. So Dr. Isenbugel was the director at the Zurich Zoo, and he also had Icelandic horses. And he saw what Linda was doing and he said, well, do you think it could help this, whatever the animal was? And so she was having a, like a tour of the zoo, and these little cubs had distemper and were like frothing at the nose and so on. And she did the raccoon touch, the very, very small touches of the tips of the fingers all around the nose, the face, and so on. And she only did it on one, and the others watched and benefited as well. Which again is, there's so many things that we don't understand in this life, and it doesn't mean that they don't work, because they all recovered and they didn't think that they would.
It's very interesting. That we have something within Horseboy Method called sensory work, which came out of when my son first started going to Betsy, the horse that he made the first contact with. He would just lie on her, and I would keep a hand on him to, steady him. But she would graze, and he would use her body like a big old couch. But he would find ways. He would have certain preferred ways to lie on her, and when he would turn around on her and lie with his head on her butt, and sort of hug the butt, we call that the butt hug now, within Horseboy Method, the effects on her would be the same as the effect on him. She would effectively go into almost a state of hypnosis, or his sensory stuff would calm down. Her sensory system would clearly calm down. But as you say, the other animals in the vicinity, because there were always two other horses in the field, whenever he did that, would always begin to come closer and then absolutely mimic the same nervous system release, sort of hypnotic state, almost literally drooling with a sort of a string of drool connecting their mouths to the grass, that she was. And we've seen this time and time and time again. And as you know, the hormones that we produce for stress are fairly contagious. That's why, crowds are dangerous. But equally, what's not so talked about is that pleasure and comfort and soothing also seems to be the contact high, effectively. So when you talked about those clouded leopards, I was thinking about the other horses and I've observed this with TTouch when Linda's been at our place and has been working on one of our horses. Any horse that's within about 25, 30 feet is clearly benefiting and clearly participating. When you're moving the skin in these ways, where you're sort of lifting, whether it's the python lift or whether it's the owl or whether it's the clouded leopard, are you working with fascia, or are you working with epidermis, or are you working with both? What do you feel you're accessing mostly or most directly?
I have no idea.
That's an honest answer.
It's Ricky Schultz is a vet in Denmark, and she wrote with another German a book on fascia a couple of years ago for dogs and for horses. And she spent 3 months.
Fasciaism? Sorry, I had to go there.
Yeah, right. There you go. She spent 3 months with me on my farm when she was in vet school. And then I think in about 2012, as a vet, she wrote an article called "A Woman Ahead of Her Time" about Linda and TTouch, and was her feeling that the touches affected connective tissue, which connective tissue is fascia is connective tissue, but not all connective tissue is fascia. So it's very, very, very connected. And in their very old form of bodywork, and instead of meridians, like fascia connective tissue carries information faster into more areas of the body than meridian. So we don't have to know where they are. That's actually the beauty of this work. Is so my interest is finding out what the horse says. Yes, this is acceptable for me. That's the most important thing. Is yeah, then they might go, oh, I'm not sure. And then you change it a little bit. You change the pressure, the speed, the type of touch, the part of the hand. You may do a pause, and then you go to where they seem okay. And then you kind of move away, and they go, you get it. And from there is when, so I feel that interaction of having the animal say, yes, this is okay, is the most important thing that we do. That's why we also have so many touches, because and when someone says my animal can't be touched, I'll kind of go, what have you done? And it's like, because if you multiply the types of touches with the pressure, with the speed, with the direction, and you have infinite numbers. Now, we also have the body wraps, and what I've started.
That's what I was going to ask you about next. So thank you for taking us there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, of course, the body wraps basically bring information through the nervous system. When I talked to Ricky Schultz about it, she said they also follow fascia lines. So maybe that's part of it. And what they affect is the superficial fascia. And it's interesting how these things progress. Because when you were talking about, the sensory integration and so on, is that we do things because they work. And if they don't work, we do something else. And then later on, the science proves that they work. And it's kind of like, oh, good. Well, we've known that for a long time, but that's kind of nice to have that sort of validation. And so the body wraps give them a sense of where they are in space. They're not intended to give support, but rather feedback. What I've started to do is take the wraps, because we always did belly lifts. Belly lifts are amazing with wraps. We started out, for colic with towels and so on. The wraps are so much more subtle. And my experience is that horses respond so well, and dogs too, especially if they have any touch sensitivity. So any kind of touch defensiveness, which many beings have, the wraps can be useful. So I started taking a wrap, and instead of putting it necessarily around the body, is taking it across the body, and either just put it on the body and either just stretch it a little and then pause and slowly release the stretch, or putting it against the body so that it's, kind of firmly placed, and then moving it in a circle and a quarter. Once again, you're moving tissue. This is way less threatening for beings that have touch, concerns. Or we started actually with a horse that had a very roached back. And of course, we have always done, lifts on the legs with the wraps, and, so that you're supporting the tissue up a bit. And along the neck is also amazing. But we thought, well, what would happen if we took it across the top of the back and we actually just gently stretched it down and paused. And then we slowly released the stretch. And the horse's back went from being really roachy to flattening. And that was our first thought of, wow, this could be pretty interesting to do. So I have one of our instructors in Australia works with a lot of racehorses, and she uses this with horses with kissing spine, horses with a lot of things that are super fit for work, so they can be really sensitive about contact. And when I showed this to Ricky Schultz, she said, yes, I think you're really affecting the superficial fascia. So we call it fascial integration. And it's interesting because, of course, everybody wants to go everything deep, and, the fascia, the iron, the fascia, and so on. And now, guess what? They're finding that maybe it actually is a little more beneficial to do less.
Can you describe the wraps? I think it's hard for people that haven't seen the body wraps to know what it is you're talking about. So just for listeners, we're not talking about the horse resembling an Egyptian mummy. These are specific wraps that go around specific parts of the body. And one of the things which I love about them is that you can do them in movement. And they can have all sorts of beneficial effects there too. Could you describe to us, please, Robyn, a fairly typical series of types of wrap you would do, more or less what they look like? What are you actually using for the wraps? And, for somebody to just get a bit of a pictorial understanding of it in their head.
If you've ever had a sprained ankle or a sprained wrist or whatever, you will have had some sort of tensor bandage on your wrist or your ankle. Now, on your ankle, they probably put it rather tight for support. So it felt good at first, but then it would start to ache after a while. So literally, it's any type of elastic bandage. Now, we pay attention to the amount of stretch there is, but in general, even if you had a leg wrap for the horse, the challenge is the German ones are really tight to stretch, but there's some that are really soft. So you take a wrap. The first thing that I would do, you could use a polo wrap. I mean, if that's what you have and you have nothing else, you could use a polo wrap. It won't give you the same amount of stretch.
Okay, so ideally, what wrap would you use?
depends where you live, because there's a lot
What's
of
your
wraps
ideal? What's your
available. So
ideal?
what I do is we use a lot of Ace wraps. We use Hartman. There's different companies that make, they're basically medical elastic. Generally, all cotton is good. That's what Ace stands for, all cotton elastic, no latex, because it changes the way the stretch is. But there's lots that are available. So with the average horse, I would use a 4-inch or 10 centimeter wrap that is pretty common to be sold in the store. And that's what most polo wraps are. They're about 10 centimeters wide. I would start with it just going around the base of the neck. And what it does is it helps to release that. So many horses brace at the base of the neck, and it just gives them an awareness about, can they release that base of the neck? It's the same with people. You put a very light wrap around the shoulders. They may not, ideally, they don't feel it. It's not feeling tight. And you'll notice in maybe 15 or 20 minutes, the shoulders start to let go. They start to actually let go into that wrap. So the same kind of thing that I might do, the easiest thing to do, start with it around the base of the neck. With young horses, the next step that we would do is we would put it around the girth area and attach it to the base wrap, or the wrap that's around the base of the neck, because we want to prepare them for the feeling of something around their middles, or a horse that happens to be girthy or, sort of cold backed and so on, can also be beneficial. Then I ideally you move them after each thing that you add, if you can, especially the first time, because you can be surprised at the amount of change in posture that happens with just a simple wrap, or even a wrap.
When you say you move them, would you take the wrap off and move them, or would you?
No, move them with the wrap on. Take them for a little walk, just to see. Just move them a little bit to see is there a change in the posture? Is there a change in their balance point? Do they now have a leg at each corner, or are they really straddle? You may see, are they really leaning forward? They may take them back so that the chest comes over the front legs. You don't know. You just observe. That's where it's a good practice to simply observe what you're seeing. And because this is the other thing, about TTouch, when I went into the sort of application that we have, most bodywork doesn't take them into kind of mindful movement. It's changing a little bit now, but that's what's so important, because if we can't change how they move, just standing still and releasing isn't really useful, because most people ride their horses or they do something with them. And that's why we want to take it. And the wraps can help to take that into movement. So that's the simplest thing that I have people start with. Now, if a horse has worn a rug, like worn some kind of blanket, and they're comfortable around things around their hind end, then we might add a wrap that goes around the hindquarters. Now, what I've started to do is a chunking down, because that's the thing. When we can break things into small pieces, we can make it easier for people even to observe and for horses to accept. So I might take that wrap and just between my two hands, stretch it across the like just one side of the rear end, maybe to the tail, so it's going just around the buttocks. Do a little stretch, pause, and slowly release. I might do that from both sides. That's going to give you an idea of how the horse might feel when you put a little figure 8 wrap that goes around the chest, crosses over the withers, comes back around the hindquarters, and attaches back to itself, which would take 2 or 3 wraps, depending on the length of your wraps.
Okay. So you also do a wrap, which I've seen, it's intriguing to me, around the top of the head. Please talk to me about that.
Once again, one of the things that has been so helpful for us, you asked how did Linda, how does a horse person go to work with these different animals? I would say that I have learned as much working with species that are unfamiliar to me and transferring that information to species that are familiar to me than with the knowledge that I have. Because as you say, if you're a longtime horse person, quote unquote, what's right, what's wrong, how you do things. And when you go to a species you don't know much about or anything about, you have to open your mind to something else. And so with the head wraps, it started with a dog. I remember the dog. I had a little face wrap on him because he was doing a lot of barking and so on, just to bring awareness around his muzzle. And he took his paw and he pushed it up to his forehead. And so here it is across the forehead, and he was absolutely calm and quiet and totally okay with it. And so I showed this at one of our advanced trainings, and one of our vets, who is a holistic vet, said, could be that. So the front of the forehead is the start of the governing vessel, and that is a calming point. So it could be, and it's not about pressure. It's just about this little awareness that maybe that's one of the things that's calming them. Now, we were discussing this at the celebration last weekend. And the other thing is that the head wrap, where the points that it does, maybe what it does is it connects our new brain to our old brain. And so it's connecting the different parts, sort of different neurological parts of the body. And what we've seen with horses that are, like, say, really hyper excited, concerned about things, wrap, and I usually start with just take it twice around the neck, a little bit behind the ears, and then bring one of them forward over the ears. That's the easiest way to do it for someone. Horses will suddenly calm down. They will they'll still look around, but it just takes them down a notch. Now, if you put it on a horse that's really quiet, it can make them too quiet. So you just take it off, and then it's okay. I think that it also helps them come more into their own bodies rather than being external. There are these external horses that they're just aware of everything, but not themselves. I think it helps to bring them more into themselves. Certainly helps people.
I've seen Linda when she was out with us. We had 3 stallions who could be quite stalliony, and she would sometimes work with her fingers inside the mouth, not as in jaw flexions, but actually on the gums around the front of the teeth. And remember the first time I saw her do it, I was like, oh gosh, I hope you don't lose a finger. And quite the opposite. This seemed to be a massively calming experience for the horses. Can you talk to us a little bit about those gum releases and how they work?
So the mouth TTouch, if we think about that, the mouth is one of the closest connections we have to the limbic system, really primary controller of lots of different, basic functions of the body. And we can see that in horses and in dogs and in people, when people will say, yes, I'm just fine. And their upper lip is like really stiff and really tight when they're totally not fine. And we see it with horses too. And so what we found is that, and I recommend to people who aren't so familiar with horses is, start with the backs of your fingers, so fingers curved, and do some circular touches around the outside of the muzzle.
Okay.
And you want to hold one hand lightly on the halter and the other hand, because it's about steadying the horse, like giving the horse a little bit of a parameter without, holding tightly, but you're safer that way. You're in better balance. And so you can go around and the chin, you should feel around the chin. When horses are super generally emotional about something, the chin may be super tight, really, really tight. So this touch brings awareness. People have the same thing. Going around the outside, and then we teach people about keeping their fingers together and being able to go in up on the side of the mouth, or just gently taking the side of your index finger and coming around the inside of the upper lip or the lower lip. Thumb is really helpful. And it's actually the thing we recommend to mouthy horses, which is the exact opposite of what, people would actually expect. And, you can learn so much. I remember I was teaching somewhere, and they had a young quarter horse, and the horse had started to become really difficult to bridle. And so what I did is I went and I did some work on the outside of the mouth, and I went in where the gum meets the upper lip with the side of my index finger, and just kind of gently rubbing back and forth. And if the mouth is dry, wet your hand. And what I felt was he had a tooth that was cracked and it was hanging. So he was young and he was changing his teeth. So imagine what that would feel like for him. Yes, he's cooperative about having the bit in, and then he starts to change his teeth and it hits the tooth. Wonder he didn't want it in. Once they could understand that, they changed what they did. And I think that one of our, I think the biggest and the most important aspect of this work is to understand that behavior is a form of communication. Particularly if you have a horse that suddenly the behavior changes, really look deeply, because in my experience, there is always a reason. Always.
Just writing that down. Behavior is a form of communication. Look deeply. There's always a reason. I love that.
And I can tell you that there have been times that I've worked with horses and I've thought to myself, maybe this one just doesn't, maybe there's one that now they're just, and I have to tell you that on those horses, I found that there's been such a reason that they didn't cooperate, that it was a miracle that they could do what they could. And it's often not found until a dissection is done. And in the dissection, and Sharon May Davies is doing amazing work with doing dissections. And usually they're on animals that people have gone through everything, like all sorts of, sort of westernized and allopathic and some holistic medicine. And there's nothing that can change what's going on. And when they do a dissection, they find that organs are in the wrong place. There's ribs are in different configurations. So I consider that it's a miracle what horses actually do for us in reality.
No, I agree. And it's an interesting thing too, that in our current season of horsemanship in the West, there's of course a very well-meaning, and it comes from a good place, emphasis on, we don't want our horses to suffer. So trying to do less or ask less or put less pressure on or whatever. And one of the things that one often gets told is, well, a horse can feel a fly, walking on its back. Is that, well, yes, but so can I. And I can feel that. And sometimes that feeling feels not good. And sometimes that feeling feels good. And I can wear a backpack and hike up a mountain, even if that backpack isn't made customized for me. And if my shoulders are a bit sore after a day or two of that, they seem to get less sore later, unless there's something desperately wrong with the backpack or it's just way too heavy or something. So that we seem to have gotten to a point where we're being told that anything with the sympathetic nervous system, any kind of stress, is automatically bad. And of course, this isn't necessarily so. So yeah, horses can be very stoic about what they put up with, people too. And I think people often go through life bearing an awful lot of discomfort, but not necessarily suffering, because it becomes familiar. Sometimes suffering, sometimes not. Like something that you mentioned, like the tooth hanging and knocking against a bit, no doubt, But if someone maybe had the ribs in the wrong place, I'm equating it to a human now, or an organ in a weird place, but had sort of learned to compensate for that and go through life, or are they suffering? They might communicate that they are, or they might not communicate they are, or they might say, no, I'm actually not. This is sort of my reality. This sort of feels all right to me. And then maybe an autopsy would be done on them and one would look at them and go, my God, how did you get through life? So to me, it's an endless mystery, as you say, and a miracle. I mean, there's the other thing too, which is that God didn't invent ponies to carry monkeys, right? So just by sitting up there, we're got to some degree, negatively affect the thing that's carrying us. And yet at the same time, a horse can go on into their 30s quite happily carting monkeys about. As you say, it's a miracle. And speaking of miracles, when we go into the sphere of the therapeutic, I always feel that that's where you enter this sort of quantum area with horses, where suddenly what you think you know about them dissolves into a miasma of what's actually going on. And you yourself told me a story. I'd love it if you would retell that story about the girl with cerebral palsy, because I think that really illustrates that point. Would you be so kind as to tell listeners that story?
Yeah. And I do think that I do think that horses are here to teach us a lot. I really do believe that. And I think that we still have to be their stewards.
Without a doubt.
So I think we have to look at a lot of things. So about, I don't know, 35 years ago, I was approached by a family that had, she'd been taking riding lessons at the local therapeutic riding facility. And
This was in Canada.
this is in Canada. And they wanted to get a horse for her. And we bred Icelandics at that point. And I had a young Icelandic. Like, we don't start our horses until they're 4. And then we start really riding them maybe at 5 and carry on. And so I said, well, come on out. And I have a horse that might be useful, because I wanted a really smooth horse. And this was a gelding who actually had no trot. And one of the reasons, and you probably know this, but one of the reasons that gaited horses can be so helpful is because their motion is more side to side than forward and back. So it actually counterbalances the lack of stability with, if riders don't have the like forward and back stability, sort of like evens it out a little. So they came out and they put her in a wheelchair, and she was quite pretty nonverbal. Like, she could make sounds and so on, but she didn't really speak. And so I brought this little horse Bangsy out, and I said, you can meet him in the wheelchair. And he put his nose down and he sniffed all around her. He'd never seen a wheelchair before. He just sniffed all around him, and she loved it. Of course, he sniffed her hair and he sniffed everything. And then I said, well, I think you could put her on him. And he separated just like he was like bracing himself, so it'd be very stable for her to be put on. And like his legs kind of out there, and there he was. So her father put her on. And of course, at the time, what he did, he was told to, because her muscles were very contracted, he told her, he would pull her legs down. And I said, can I show you something that might be easier for her? So I showed some python lifts. So I literally put my hand on the leg and I supported the tissue up a bit, and I paused, and then I slowly carried it down, and her legs just melted around the horse. And it was fascinating, because whenever she'd come out and her father would go to pull her legs down, she'd point at me to do the other thing with her legs. So we started off by leading her with him, and he was very good. And we had sidewalkers like she was used to, but she'd fallen off with sidewalkers. Like, she was pretty unbalanced. We graduated to her riding. We ponied her. We found that actually ponying her was the easiest thing, because if she started to lose her balance, we could just kind of, take her arm and pull her back on it. And we took her out in the trail. We took her out, and the thing is, her parents said, listen, this is so much joy for her. She would smile and laugh, and she would make these kissing sounds when she wanted to go faster. And then he would tolt, and she would like just grin. And then he'd canter it like a little rocking horse. And she had freedom for the first time in her life. And I have to say that we moved from Alberta to BC, and that was the thing that was the hardest, was leaving her, because she moved to another place, but it wasn't the same in terms of what she got. But the relationship, this horse, we would know when she was coming out, because he would be standing at the gate 10 minutes before she arrived. And never any other time. So we'd, Eileen must be on her way out. And there she is. But the joy and the relationship that this horse, I feel that this horse felt it was his purpose, in a way, to have this person, because she just adored. She would feed him carrots, and he would slobber all over her, and she adored it. It was the thing in her life that gave her, I think, the most freedom. So it was very an impactful experience for us.
I had a horse once. It was an extraordinary horse. He died last year. Ripe old age, just found dead in the field, the best way to go. We had a kid come out to us that had drowned and was completely unresponsive, but alive. And people said, well, he's sort of a vegetable. He won't give you any sort of feedback at all. Do you think you could do something? And, you get these emails, you're like, gosh, I really don't know. I'm not hubristic enough to say that we could, but I'm obviously not going to say don't come. So they came, and we were all a bit nervous. This quarter horse Clue, who was a grumpy old bastard, like he proved to me that I cannot train a horse. Anything that I tried with him, I was like, nope, nope, nope. But yet he would do everything if it was his idea. So he was the consummate horse I could always rely on if I had to go, say, do something in the city, or stunts like going to a department store or a nightclub while the band is playing to talk to people about autism. Stuff like that, he'd just be rock solid because he found it interesting, basically. He'd go, oh, okay, fine, that's kind of amusing, I'll do that. But if it didn't interest him, he'd be like, no, sorry. And my attempts to, dressage the horse were laughable. But this kid in the chair is brought out, and Clue looks over. He must have been about 100 meters away in the field. He looked around and he just came straight over, did exactly what you talked about, sniffed everything, sniffed the chair. And I wasn't thinking, oh, we're going to work with Clue or anything. I was sort of standing there thinking, I don't know what we're going to do. And then he began to lick the child all over the body. Never seen anything like this before. Haven't seen it since either. I don't mean a couple of licks. I mean a bath, a tongue bath. What's going on? I don't know what's going on. So long and the short of it is we put the child on top, and the child began to respond, and the child began to point and make noises and indicate what they wanted. And what was passing between Clue and this child, one could only guess at. What was passing between your girl and that young horse? How did he know that she was going to come 10 minutes before? Okay, maybe he could identify the sound of the car at a certain distance or something like that, but chances are it sounded much the same as other cars. What did he know, and how? As you said earlier in this interview, observation is everything. And yeah, isn't it interesting how often it still leaves us scratching our heads?
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. Now, you don't, of course, just work with horses, you work with dogs. And one of the things which we're often desirous of people who work with the equine-assisted field to do is don't just work with horses, because social animals, we monkeys, you never know what the person's going to get into. You never know what other feedback is going to come from other animals. Talk to us about the work that you do with dogs, because the dog is the sort of most obvious one that most people have access to. Most special needs people, most people needing some sort of therapy, they don't really have access to horses. They might come out to your barn, they might come out to my barn, but it's not their daily life. Dogs can be. Can you talk to us about the TTouch you do with dogs and the work you do with dogs? How similar is it to the work you do with horses, and what are the contexts that you find it useful in?
Well, when we first started, of course, Linda started the work with horses, and then it was like, oh, well, could you work with dogs as well? And could you work with other animals? And we didn't really know. My interest in working with people with dogs is to, again, have dogs have as much choices as possible in life. It's not, none of us have complete choice, for sure. I feel like it's so important to pay attention. I think dogs get misread so often. I think these dogs, oh, my dog's so happy to see everybody. It's like, but are they really? So what does that look like, is what I always ask people, is what does that, like, oh, I'm so happy look like? Well, they're bouncing all around and they're, tails wagging and they're jumping on people and so on. And it's like, well, could it be that their behavior is sort of disproportionate to the situation? My dog, when I come home, or one of my dogs, both of my dogs, when I come home from being away, they're like super excited. That's kind of predictable. But if someone comes that doesn't know a dog at all and they have this, super highly aroused behavior, I feel like it's simply arousal, and it isn't necessarily, it may be how they cope with this sort of situation. And so I encourage people to be calmer around dogs and not like get into this, you're such a good dog, and this ruffling things with dogs they don't know. And this like, whack, whack, whack is supposed to be such the same with horses. You know, do you think the horses really think that when we smack them when we're happy and we smack them when we're mad, that it's, means, it's okay. So I just want people to be able to live in our homes, is to help people build a relationship and understand that they can meet as many needs as the dogs as they can. And that's not always easy in the lifestyle. We live on a farm. You probably do too. Our dogs have a lot of freedom. We have sheep and we have cows. And I was thinking about all the animals. We have sheep and cows that are super friendly. And so people get to interact with them because because they've been handled, but they also have freedom. So, there's that kind of thing. So I would say that the biggest thing is to help dogs and their people be in physical, emotional, and mental balance. That would be our aim. And if we can have people start to pay attention to that, they start to observe their dogs in a different way and maybe understand again their behavior a little bit more. Dogs really do a lot for us because they live in our homes and they are so emotionally attached to people, reading their emotions of how they're feeling. And I think that a lot of times if people looked at their dogs, they could know what's going on for them as well. And it's like my acupuncturist would say to me, so, how are your moods? And I'd go, don't ask me, ask my husband or ask my kids or ask whatever. I don't necessarily know what's going on, but I feel like we can really see a reflection a lot of times with our dog.
I would say, when you're using TTouch with dogs, give me some examples about what you'd use for what situations and what you would show. What are the sort of go-tos that you typically find yourself helping?
So with puppies, I'm going to start puppies and go through old age. First thing is with puppies is we use what we call containment. So contain versus restraint. Those are kind of words that we use even for foals, whatever it is. So if we can teach people to make mindful contact on the body, like gently stroke the ears, for instance, gently the mouth and the paws, not just desensitization, but actually help them be comfortable by doing little bits of touch and contact and so on with a puppy. So it could be any type of touch. Usually we teach a little bit of the ear slides, maybe a bit of tail touches, and just some gentle work on the body, because that can be so calming for puppies that are like over the top. And then as they're going into sort of more, adolescent and they're kind of over the top, then we start into, again, some touches, because they'll go through a period where maybe they're a little bit, they're kind of reactive to touch. And that doesn't mean in a negative way, but they get sort of hyperactive, if you will. So maybe we have to change our touch. Maybe we have to change what we do. Maybe we want to take them into mindful movement. And this is it's not about training the dog. It's so like with the horses, we use different elements like the labyrinth and maybe different surfaces and so on, so that we can have short periods of making a connection with them through doing mindful movement. Mindful and slow movement builds muscle at a deeper level than fast movement does. So if we can have these moments of helping them come into physical balance, that can be super helpful. Same with, building a relationship. Relationship is so important because it's that relationship that they want to cooperate. They want to be with you. They, and that's what we're looking for, is how can we build a relationship? Years ago when we had our first companion animal training, and it was up here and it was in the winter and it was really colder than it should be. So we went down to a local school and there was a kindergarten class in progress. So we sent a couple of our practitioners into the kindergarten with a couple of stuffed dogs to talk to them about how they make contact with their dogs at home. And we got the feedback that, like, from two of the kids, one of them said, our dog never wanted to be with me, but after I started, doing these touches, the dog wanted to be with me. And the same thing with the cat. The cat started to come and sleep on my bed, and I always wanted the cat to make a connection, but it didn't like me. And it just, it was just showing them a different way of of making contact and being mindful with that. So that was, that's so powerful when you can give children a way to help them build a relationship in that way. And then, of course, with older dogs, we have a husky cross that'll be 15 in April, and so we do T-touches on him regular. He's losing a little bit of the connection of his back end, so we put a little porter wrap where it just goes across the chest, across over the back, and then attaches. So it's just one wrap around the chest and one going around the middle. It stabilizes him to the point that he's not losing his hind legs. He can get out and be really, really jaunty. So you can really use it throughout their whole life. And I feel that when we build relationship with them, they want to listen to us. They want to cooperate. They want to be with us. So of course you can use it with any modality that you're using, but I feel like I feel like relationship is what most people want with their animals.
Yeah, I think it's what most animals want, if they're mammals in particular, with us and with each other. And it's so interesting how, although, for example, I'm sure this was the case for you when I was growing up, it was very much the case of dominate. We weren't actually ever told to dominate in those words, but it was, you make him do what he's got to do what you want to do, blah, 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 blah. That was the accepted. And myths like, say the horse didn't want to go past something or something, if you get off, he's won. You've told him he's won. Then I realized after a while that it wasn't true at all. The horses didn't think like that. But nonetheless, as a kid, this is the feedback one was getting. And you could see the utilitarian imperatives that had made that way of thinking become ingrained in the culture. However, what it always still came down to when you heard people talking about good horsemen, or when the people really started talking about their horses, it always came back to relationship. Even that, but they'd be sort of a bit embarrassed about it. And they'd be like, well, we don't really want to admit that we're sentimental, or, that we might. You were allowed to say you loved your horse. You were allowed to say you loved your dog. You weren't really allowed to say you loved your kid or your wife or your mum.
Right.
But it's, we come out of this militaristic society, and Pony Club, we were all brought up that way. This came out of the military, and you could see how that way of screaming at people and effectively making them fall off actually might be quite useful if you were trying to train raw recruits for the cavalry, and they had to withstand screams, stress, falling off, getting shot out of the saddle. And, that's why the sergeant screams in your face, so that, when you're under fire, you aren't so stressed. Okay. In that battle situation, maybe that's useful. But then what happens when you come out of the battle? What happens if you're never in the battle? What happens if you never wanted to be in a battle? So I think so many of us and so many of our animals have had to undergo this sort of approach, which got looked at as a kind of a virtue because it created toughness, resilience, that sort of thing. But did it really create resilience, or did it just create desensitization with problematic, traumatized behaviors that came out later? And the answer probably was often sure. So when you guys were first putting TTouch together, as you said earlier in this conversation, that Linda was about 20 years ahead of her time. And I think you're right. I think that I remember when I first started hearing about her, the type of conversation that we're having now was not by any means the norm. And she must have, and you must have, encountered a lot of resistance. How did you deal with that? I mean, beyond the kind of, okay, well, it's all right if people disagree with us, but and I know that, people in the horse world can be pretty awful. You must have come in for your fair share of that, especially in the early years. What were your strategies for coping with that and staying sort of true to your methods and seeing it sort of borne out over time? Because you also must have been asked to question yourselves a lot as well. I'm sort of intrigued by how you weathered all of that. And,
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that early on there were, because, we have articles dating back to, I think in 1981, Practical Horseman did an article called How to Soften Your Horse's Defenses. And it was
Okay.
primarily about doing it turned into a little booklet, and it sold really well. And from that, we ended up, then we'd do these little workshops and we'd have people come. So the people who came were people who were looking for something.
Okay.
And so I think that it kind of filled a need. So for the most part, we didn't have people coming. They didn't pay money to come and go, well, this is a load of, whatever. And I remember, and when did we go to Australia? We went and we did this transformation on the trail in sometime in the 80s. And I did a little demo. I went and I did a little 2-day demo, and there was a couple there he was shortlisted for the Australian 3-day team, and they were lifelong horse people and so on and so forth. And they saw it. And then I was coming back to Australia. They organized for me to come and do a 7-day training, because what they said was what they saw and the change that they saw in the horse, they were smart enough to realize that there must be something to it. That I think that's the thing. And so, to be honest, some of the things that happen with what we do sound ridiculous. It just sounds like, even, I'm sometimes just shocked at some of the things that happen. And I like that, because nothing makes me more sort of suspicious of something when someone says, oh, piece of cake, easy, I can fix that. Like, these are beings we're working with all these different circumstances. So I did have, I would have sometimes people come and it was hard if they brought their own horse and they tell the story and so on. And then we could do things with their horse that they couldn't in a very, very short period of time. And we have to be really careful with that, because it's hard for someone if like, oh, my horse won't let anybody else do ABC, whatever it is. And so we didn't go right into it, but we would kind of work our way into that. And soon we would be doing ABC that they had trouble doing and no one else could do. So you have to be really careful how you talk to those people, because they feel like, what was wrong with me that I couldn't do it? Those
humiliating. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we never wanted to have anyone feel like that. It is not our interest in proving anything. Nothing. It's not our interest. And so, I remember sometimes I remember one big guy that came on a weekend I was teaching. And he stood there with his arms crossed and, kind of standing back. And then he started asking me these questions, and he started asking me that, like, if I looking at him, I was, thinking, oh, he's, I'm not sure where the question's coming from. But I took from him that his question was an honest question. I just said, and he said to me after, it was an honest question. I really wanted to hear your answer. And so he got super interested, and he trained a lot of horses. He was with the RCMP and RCMP ride and so on and so forth. And he came to some clinics, and he started to incorporate some of the things that he did. So the questions I love the questions. You see, I think it's really good, because if there were no questions, there'd be no answers. And it's really the questions, like, they can be intimidating depending on how you take it. So I would say in the beginning, it was a bit of a challenge, although most of the animals that came to us because they hadn't been able to do anything else with them. So it was like, it's the same with the dogs. It was sort of like the last chance, and so it was, I guess it was tricky, but, and there would be, of course there's skeptics about everything, but it was just kind of holding that place that if they were interested, great. If they weren't, I'm not going to argue.
Yeah.
If you're a horse nerd, and if you're on this podcast, I'm guessing you are, then you've probably also always wondered a little bit about the old master's system of dressage training. If you go and check out our Helios Harmony program, we outline there step by step exactly how to train your horse from the ground to become the dressage horse of your dreams in a way that absolutely serves the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of the horse and the rider. Intrigued? Like to know more? Go to our website, heliosharmony.com. Check out the free introduction course. Take it from there.
I remember when the great German dressage rider, showing my age here, Klaus Balkenhol,
Yeah.
started bringing Linda over to Germany. And he was, the top winning dressage Olympic ex-policeman, not a particularly sentimental dude, I should imagine. And yet saw clearly the value of this work. Tell us a little bit about that and how that evolved. Because I think there will be people who are listening here who are also sport and performance riders and so on, and very much in that German tradition. Why did he decide TTouch was a good thing? And how did you observe and how did he observe that it helped his performance horses?
Well, I wasn't there with Linda at any time with him, but when I understand and see, I think if they've done a lot with the horse, because my understanding is one of his horses, he'd spent a lot of time with him, just time. And he would, as sentimental or not, he would go in the stall, he would just spend time with the horse. And it wasn't responding. And then Linda worked with him and the horse made a huge response. And I don't know what year that was, but I know that in 1989, when, Dr. Klimke did his last big event at the LA Equestrian Center.
That's Rainer Klimke, for those people who were born
right.
decades and don't know who that was. He was the best.
And of course, his daughter is Ingrid Klimke.
His daughter is Ingrid, yeah.
Yeah. And he did, so the scenario was there would be 12 riders, through training level through Grand Prix, two each, and 2,500 spectators, which is pretty intimidating to ride in front of that.
Of Germans too, yeah.
Yeah. Well, this was in LA.
Oh, okay.
So
okay.
This is in Los Angeles.
The crowd.
Right. So he was the last one that he did. And Linda was invited because Linda had met him. Linda met him before Klaus Balkenhol. And I think he was amazing. I mean, in terms of how he interacted with the horses and so on. So anyway, we did this. So the night before it started, there was a demo with some of the horses that were in it. So Linda did this demo. We helped. There were, 20 practitioners there. And we worked on the horses in between the lessons. And so it was fascinating. There was a horse that had lost his Piaffe, Grand Prix horse, but California Horse of the Year, and then lost the Piaffe. So when Linda worked with him in the demo, one of the things we noticed is he was very sensitive on his belly. And so she would take the wand, the stiff kind of dressage whip, and just stroke him all over. And as she he was known for putting boots on him or anything, he would kick out with his hind legs. So people had to be careful. Now, here's the reality. If that horse wanted to hurt someone, he would. He's just saying, be careful, careful, be careful. And they were careful. So anyway, I was asked to work with him, to do some body work with him in between. And this horse his sheath was so dirty, and he had to have a general anesthetic to have his sheath cleaned. General anesthetic. So I started with him in the stall, and he's the horse that probably taught me the most about listening to whispers. And I started with my hand started just behind his ears and just really quietly running my hand across his body. And whenever he would, just move an ear a bit, I would pause. And then I would go back to where he did his ear or his mouth would move. And I worked my way back. And when I got to the belly, I used the back of my hand. First, I used the wand, the same kind of thing. And I would just pause. And then I took the back of my hand and I worked along the belly and same deal. I got to the sheath area. I've never seen anything like it in my life. He probably had 2 inches of hard schmegma inside the sheath. Now tell me how you could do Piaffe when you had, it was that uncomfortable.
Where do you think that had come from? And why was that in him and not in other horses?
Well, that's a very good
physiologically.
Very good. I don't know, but I think there's something systemically going on that would create that amount of, I don't know what it was, but it was hard. what was interesting is when I had listened to him, and this didn't take me very long. In the first session, I worked with him for, I don't know, less than an hour, but people would walk by and they'd go, "Oh, have you tranquilized him?" Because he was standing there with his head down, no halter on, just like he was tranquilized. I said, "No, but I could work on the outside of the sheath." He actually he wanted contact because it must have been so uncomfortable. So I used the backs of my fingers and just did a bit. And then I was able to get this Excalibur, some softening. It's a product that softens the inside and around the sheath area. I was able to get it softened, and then I was able to get warm water. I couldn't take anything off because it's like having thick scabs, but I could soften it. And by the third day, he had PI.
Interesting.
Which I think was so interesting, but it was fascinating at this event because we, of course, were showing people how to use the balance rein. It's like a second rein around the base of the neck, used as a second rein to just steady the horse, and made a huge difference to some of the horses. And we also put some body wraps and promise wraps, which just went around the back end of the horse. And of course, at lunchtime at the LA Equestrian Center, the people that boarded there were like, 20 or 30 horses out there, trying it with their own horses, which was great, just to be able to kind of offer that. And, Dr. Klimka was such a gracious man. And, he said he'd never seen so many changes in horses and riders in such a short period of time. And he really attributed it to Linda coming in the work that we did, which he didn't need to do that. He was just an amazingly gracious man. So that was it was interesting because most of the people that were there were either competitors or really interested in the sport. Certainly some kind of sport riders. Now, Linda's also worked with people like Ann Krasinski, who was on the American jumping team, and she did a demo with her at Wellington in Florida and had all these people standing around watching this horse who was known for rushing fences. Linda worked with her, got her riding with a neck ring, nothing else on, and jumping 4-foot oxers, coming in really balanced, jumping them, not rushing after them, slowing down. And it was quite a shock for them. So if people see that there can be a difference, then they become interested. Now, can they always kind of carry on with it? Because some things require that we as a human have to make some changes. And, there's only one thing on this earth that we have the potential to control, and that's ourselves. And when we change something will change. So I always say to people, if something isn't working, I don't care what it is, just change something a little bit, or pause, or just take a moment. But just that in itself can make a huge difference, makes a difference between how a horse reacts, how a dog reacts, how a person reacts.
Just writing this down. If something isn't working, change something.
And it's so obvious. It's just that we get so stuck in our habits because they're so easy to do.
The devil we know. And neural pathways that, and it doesn't matter that, was it Einstein who said, insanity is doing the same thing and expecting
over and over and expecting a different result. Yeah.
But it's also natural human behavior. And I think one has got to have a bit of compassion for oneself and for people this way. I know when we're teaching people our methods and so on, so much of it is counterintuitive. And I think riders don't get enough credit for this. The entire process of doing anything with a horse is counterintuitive, both for the monkey and for the pony. We are their predator in the wild. So their instinct is not to let us certainly not within bowshot or spear chucking. Yet they will. And they're not designed to take us on their backs. Yet they will. We're not designed to balance up there. We're top heavy, big shoulders, heavy head, wobbling around on that moving barrel. Yet we do. And if when we feel anxious or even unfamiliar with something, we crouch. We go into a sort of a sympathetic nervous system crouch where we can protect our organs, throw a punch and run away all in the same movement. We can't do that on a horse, so we'll fall out the front door. And then, of course, we're monkeys, so we want to opposable thumb. So we want to solve things with our hands and cling on tight to things. And we can't do that either. So the very fact that any of it can work at all, I'm always intrigued, given that both the horse and the human have to go against instinct so much. And we're also angry, we're angry chimpanzees, and we've got to control that too. It's a miracle it can happen, and yet it does. So I think that people like you and Linda coming along and helping to make that process more joyful, to me, is really the epitome of what equine assisted means, because in this day and age, we don't need horses. Some cowboys do. I would argue that with the therapeutic work that we do, actually that is optimized by the movement of the horse. So, okay, maybe that's a necessary job for a horse, but we certainly don't need them for transport anymore. Luckily, we don't need them for war. So the reason, why do we have horses? We have horses that make us feel good. Why do we feel good around horses? And then sometimes we do things or have experience with horses that get in the way of that joy. And then we can end up thrashing away at that neural pathway, the very thing that we were hoping would make us so joyful, that we were so attracted to as a child, the beauty, the freedom, the power, the romance, the dreamlike quality of horses. And then suddenly there we are in a cage being screamed at, by another monkey, being told wrong. So you guys make it better. You open that door to joy, and I've seen it. I've seen it working, and I felt it in my own body. I've had Linda put her hands on me and gone, oh my gosh, this is extraordinary. If somebody is running a program, and equine assisted programs are often staffed, the equines in those programs are often donated horses. Donated horses are usually donated for a reason. They're usually messed up. They've been broken to some degree, and they maybe work in the program because they're quiet, but one frequently sees unhappy horses, stiff horses, horses clearly in pain. And of course, how are these horses supposed to transmit well-being when they themselves don't have it? If you were to give advice to somebody who was going into this field and getting their horses from these disparate sources, what would be your main go-tos and piece of advice that, you're in the pub, someone says, hey, Robyn, I'm going to start this thing, and I'm going to start working with autistic kids, or I'm going to start working with veterans, or I'm going to start working with people with trauma. And yeah, I've got the, some therapy, some donation horses are coming in. You probably in your mind would go, oh yeah, I can kind of picture what some of these horses will be coming in with. What would your go-to 1, 2, 3 to be sure to look out for, and to be sure to do, and to be sure to not do, be to that person?
Good question. The first thing that I do when I kind of see a horse that somebody asks me to look at a horse, whatever it is, and I kind of get a sense of, first of all, what their overall response is for just when humans are near them. And that doesn't mean that I can't influence how they feel about humans, because there are some horses that once you then, because then I would see if I could put my hands on, start with the back of the hand. Where can you actually make contact? What's the horse's response to that contact? So that I guess it depends on also what they're going to be using the horses for. Like, are they expected? Are they for riding? Because not all horses are in the equine-assisted therapy.
Very true.
They're not all for riding. So that would be one thing that I would kind of look at. And then also, the thing is, when we do TTouch on horses, we have so frequently been able to make pretty dramatic changes especially in their, and I want to say, attitude. It's not really that it's their attitude, it's their experience, their prior experience with humans. And when you change that experience because you treat them in a different way, it changes them. Because, we get horses on our farm now, mostly we board horses, but even when I have horses that come up here for clinics, and they have, people will say they do this, and this. They hardly ever do it here because we have a different energy, about the attitude that we have about the horses and what we expect them to do. So, I mean, I would encourage anybody to learn even basics of TTouch so that they can go over the horse and have the horse learn from the horse, that they'll let the horse know they'll listen to them. I think it is absolutely really critical. And of course, obviously, do you ride most of your horses with saddles?
Yes, I'm not averse to riding bareback, but in general, we would ride it with a saddle.
Yeah, no, I just, because I think that's the other huge challenge, is finding saddles that are going to be functioning well for the horse and for the riders, because it's not just enough that it's for the horse. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that have to go into it. I also would ask them, what's the lifestyle going to be for this horse? What are they going to have friends? If they have friends, do they have enough space to have friends? Like that, because that can be, having frenemies can be worse if you don't have enough space to get away from, that sort of thing. So it's not really, I can't say that I have enough experience with looking for horses, but I would be looking for horses that I would call functionally sound. That's, to me, because none of us are necessarily 100% sound, but it does depend on what you're going to do with them and how you're going to ask them and what you're going to do. And I had a little bit of a theory about this concept of us, because a lot of riders, period, whether they're able-bodied or not, are not very well balanced. Now, if you have
I wouldn't say that about myself, honestly.
Yeah, for sure. If you have a horse that always has to carry the same rider with their same imbalances and doing things exactly the same way, is it possible that it can be actually a little bit easier for horses that carry different riders that maybe have slightly different imbalances? So it's not constantly being created the same one. Because I see some lesson horses, and as you were saying earlier, there are horses that kind of go along and kind of do their job, and they're they're pretty happy about it, depending on the rider and so on. And I wonder, though, if that isn't, in some cases, if it doesn't balance out their body a little bit easier than having the same old rider who does things. I don't know.
Yeah, no. So I think what you put your finger on there is the difference between chronic, repetitive, and novel. Yeah, we encourage people to do as much in-hand work as possible, long reining as possible, that sort of thing, and incorporate that into the sessions, because otherwise you'll never have time to do it. Just to build that back as much as you can, so that it has a sporting chance of carrying some weight. But it's interesting how this type of thing is not normally part of the conversation around therapeutic stuff. It's usually all about how you serve the person, which of course is vitally important. But it leaves out, if the horse hasn't got well-being, well, how are you going to? So your point too about how is the horse living, I think, is also a very good one. Is there enough space that if they are living socially, it's functional, not dysfunctional? Because of course now keeping horses in boxes has gotten a bad name. And I go around so many different stables and I see horses living in every possible way, from having half of the state of Wyoming as their, thing, or probably, Alberta, to, for example, we've got a project with Horseboy in the middle of Dublin, like in the middle of the city. And no, the horses have to be in boxes. Now, it's mitigated by the fact that they get a lot of free movement in the arena and they get regularly rotated out to fields in County Meath. So, people they're approaching it rationally and they're approaching it compassionately. But I don't think those horses are unhappy at all, because the way they're engaged and the way that they're worked is sympathetic. And I've seen horses that are kept in rather naturalistic environments be quite depressed. So it's interesting. I've realized that there's no hard and fast rules about these things. It's so much of it seems to be, and you were talking about patting horses, do they like it? Do they hate it? Well, I think so much of it is about the intention behind it. If you hug someone and they pat you on the back, that can feel immensely supportive. It can feel also absolutely awful, depending on how they pat you and what the intention is behind the pat. So I think one of the things I love about your work is that the intention is paramount. You know, I've heard Linda say it so often, put your heart in your hands and then put your hands on the horse. And of course that could be with a person too. And I remember the first time I heard her say that, I went, oh, of course, but do I do that? And then as soon as I started consciously doing that, I heard her say that at Equitana once. I was like, oh my gosh, it made such a difference. And then another thing which I heard from TTouch was, instead of trying to make your horse feel safe or project safety, just project the thought, I am safety. I am safe. I am safety. And see what that does to yours. And I started doing it, and horses just started coming and standing right next to me. So it's so interesting how you guys have, you know, there's great complexity to your work once you begin, and subtlety to your work. And we started this conversation with Feldenkrais and so on, and the multiple different ways in which you can touch and feeling out and listening to the horse. And yet at the same time, you don't make it so vague and impossible to follow that there are no steps, and you do actually narrow it down to certain ways to touch that any of us can do, or certain intentions that we can put into our bodies that are going to transfer that emotion to the horse. And it works. So if people wanted to learn more, how do they do it? How do they get in touch with you? And then if they want to become, say, a practitioner, what's the process by which they'd have to go?
Because of COVID, like, you know, before COVID, I traveled 5 months of the year for pretty much 30 years. And I loved it. And I didn't think that I had any other choice. You know, you do what you do, right? And then COVID hit. And so I had time to put things online because I wanted to for years, but I was never home long enough to do it. And we have a platform called learn.ttouch.ca. And on that, learn.ttouch.ca.
Okay.
And we have on it, we have some free, like, little mini module courses too, that, like, one for horses and a couple for dogs and one for cats. So people can just, like, register and they don't pay anything. They get that module. It kind of takes you through the aspects of it. Now we also then have courses that are on very, like, specific things. I have a body wrapping self-paced course and intro to TTouch and so on. And then we have these, the core elements course. If people want to be practitioners or go deeper into it, I started doing them for the last almost year, is immersion courses where I take people over 6 months actually. And they have lifetime access to the online, which has many hours of the topics broken into pieces and video and PowerPoint and so on. And then in the immersion classes, I add more information. Plus we discuss things and go into the detail. And it actually worked. It's worked really well. We have a practitioner in India, the first practitioner in India. She did it all online, and she presented actually at our celebration the changes, the healing that she's had from dogs and cats in India. And she has a kind of a private rescue, and she works with lots of different rescues. Phenomenal. I mean, animals that were given no hope, and some of them, like, in one session. And as she said, you know, no one was more surprised than I was. And again, you know, as I said before, I've done this now for over 40 years, and I'm still surprised when it works. And so is Linda. And I love that, because I would hate to do something that you felt so, oh, you do this, because you can't know. We know that there'll be a change, but we don't know what. And that's the you know, the part of looking for it. So there's a lot that can be done online. Linda's going to be, not sure how much she'll be in Europe this year. She'll be at Equitana. I'm coming for a few days for Equitana.
Oh, you will? Great. We'll meet then, because we'll be there.
Yeah. I'll be there for the last 3 days to be at the party, the 50th anniversary party, and so on.
50 years. Oh my gosh! Wow.
I know, it's just remarkable. And, you know, I just have to say, I mean, my sister, there's nobody that is she cares a lot, and she's just so open to to people. She'll do a lot for people. And she's really very, very remarkable. And then I'll be in England doing something with horses and dogs in April, and France in April as well, doing a few things. And then in Holland, just doing the work with dogs in Holland. So ideally, and we do have practitioners in different countries too that are doing workshops. So because we don't do so many in-person things, my concept of this online is that if people can also go to workshops with people who are qualified practitioners and get the hands-on portion, because what they have to do is demonstrate to us through video or in person or whatever a competency.
Okay.
That's the thing. And I mean, the beauty of this is that even if you know a little bit, you can really help. And the more you know, in some ways, the less you teach. I mean, because you try to pare it down to what might be the most helpful for that person in that moment.
So if somebody wanted to go down the route also of learning to become a practitioner and or eventually trainer, it all starts with learn.ttouch.ca.
Yeah, or going to, if you have the availability of going to a workshop with someone, of course, that can be your first.
But would you find those workshops on that website?
The website that you're going to find the international ones on is TTouch.com.
TTouch.com. Okay. So if I'm sitting in London or Dubai or Rio de Janeiro, and I want to see if there's a trainer or practitioner near me that I can go to a live course with, that will be ttouch.com.
Yeah, that'll give you. There are some, like the German ones aren't on because they have their own guild site. There are, I don't know the names of all the websites of the specific countries. Like Germany has a lot of practitioners. Austria. Just trying to think of what countries have active websites right now. Switzerland, probably the UK, South Africa.
Would there be links to those sites on TTouch?
Yes, on ttouch.com, there are links to the international sites. And if they don't see something on like the site or a listing or whatever, if they go to one of those, that's the best response.
I, of course, found the German one. It's ttouch.de.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Yeah.
Which, by the way, immediately translated to English.
Yeah, no, it's a really good website.
But if people know that ttouch.com is the sort of central hub, and then they could find some links to what's relevant to their country there. Yeah. But if they want to learn online, it's learn.ttouch.ca.
Yeah. And actually a lot of the online courses, if they're with Zoom attachments, like with Zoom classes, will also be on the ttouch.com events page.
Super.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, luckily for us, my wife is heading down the practitioner path.
Yeah, she is. Yes.
Our horses benefit massively, and I couldn't support it more. I think that I see that what you guys do is not only something that's special to you and Linda, but it's highly transferable. I've seen lots of people learn it and get amazing outcomes with their animals and with each other.
And, I think that's the thing. Linda's always been, the whole thing we've been so open about, we want to share the work. If you're interested, we're happy to teach you. We're not going to try to convince someone that they need to learn it, but we're absolutely there. And it doesn't matter if Linda can do it or if I can do it or if other teachers. The aim of it is to teach the average person to be able to do it with their own animal, because it really, we can't have every animal. So if it makes sense that we can teach people how to do it, that's the deal.
Absolutely. I think the other thing which is so immediately apparent when one goes to a TTouch event is the loving quality of the community. And, with us, with Horseboy, it's quite similar. It's an international community of people that really support each other and really like each other and go out of their way to try and help each other. And I've really seen that with the TTouch community. I think the sort of person who's attracted to it is always a connected, caring human. So when you get a bunch of them together, it's a very nice place to be. I'm looking forward to Equitana
We
2025.
saw that at the celebration. We had we had a number of people that were pretty new. I don't even know how they got there, but they were just struck by the welcoming part of this kind of this family community, and it's so much fun to just meet new people and have them just become engaged in the work. But they have to have interest. It's like there's a reason that that things happen as they do.
Absolutely. And, in the world of factionalism and rivalry that can so often typify the horse world, it's such a breath of fresh air to come across people like you. So hats off.
Thank you. I mean, it's fun. I wouldn't do it if it's fun. It's like we had a great keynote speaker that spent a year with me before she went into vet school, and she said her theory is this: if it's not fun, don't do it, and if you have to do it, make it fun. And
I'm writing that one down too. If it's not fun, don't do it. And if it's not fun,
no, if you have to do it,
and if you
make
have
it
to
fun.
do it,
Yeah.
thank you. And if you
Make
have
it
to
fun.
do it, make it fun. Love it.
Yeah,
Words to live by.
They are. She gave such a great presentations, and about working with senior animals, and she had she's fun. It was a great presentation, and we had a lot of fun at the celebration.
Who was that speaker?
Her name is Stephanie Cote, Cote.
Cote as in the French.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll
Yeah.
look up. Sounds like someone I should have on the show.
Oh yeah, absolutely. She's amazing.
Stephanie with a PH. I'm writing it down.
Yeah, PH. Stephanie with a PH. I can
Cote.
get you her email if you like to.
Please do. That would
Yeah.
be grand.
Yeah.
Well, Robyn, it's been an honor. Thank you so much for coming on and giving
My
us
pleasure.
wisdom.
Yeah, my pleasure. It was so nice to meet you, and I look forward to seeing you in Germany.
Absolutely.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you like what we're doing here, please do like, subscribe, tell a friend. It so helps us to get this valuable work done and the message of equine-assisted stuff out there. And if you're interested in more conversations, you might want to check out our Live Free, Ride Free podcast. And if you'd like to support the podcasts, please go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. If you're a professional in the equine-assisted field or are considering a career in the equine-assisted field, you might want to check out our 3 certification programs: Horseboy Method, Movement Method, and Taquine Equine Integration. You can find all of those over on newtrailslearning.com. And finally, if you want to check out our cool rock and roll themed merch, back on rupertisaacson.com, please click on shop. You'll find all kinds of fun goodies there. And if you're looking for a way to spend time until the next podcast, you might want to consider reading the books that kicked all this off: The Horseboy, The Long Ride Home, and The Healing Land. So see you next time on Equine Assisted World. Join us for the adventure.